And welcome back. Um, Today's guest we have is actually. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll go ahead and I'll talk about the topic after you introduce yourself. All right.
I'm Tyler. I'm a college student majoring in writing with experience in freelance media, especially writing a lot of those clickbait news articles that you see all the time on social media. Uh, I recently viewed the documentary of The Social Dilemma and thought that it would be a really good topic for me to talk about on the show with my sort of media background, and for us to talk about as people that remember the rising age of social media.
So I guess the first thing that I want to bring up before we even actually get into the movie proper is kind of like the the differentiation between what we would consider mass media, or at least the modern news scene, and what social media is, and how that would effectively like how they kind of interplay off each other.
Yeah, so when we use the word mass media, I think the best way to what we're really talking about is traditional media. Social media can be really seen as a form of mass media as it's explicitly created to reach very wide audiences. Um, but one of the major differences between the two is that mass media is produced hoping to grab your attention for a set time period, whereas social media is looking to grab your attention, to monopolize your attention, really. And that affects how we write our news, how we understand one another, and how we understand ourselves.
So basically, what you're kind of saying is that with social media, these algorithms are optimizing for attention, or at least what what would be profitability on ad space, which is effectively attention. And through that, they've kind of circumvented the traditional idea of ratings, where the traditional idea of ratings was they took a sample size of viewership, and if they could keep the attention of the viewership for as long as the show was going on, that's good. Whereas with an algorithm, they've broken it down into such a crude science that they can, and we'll actually see this in the movie as we discuss it, where they basically monitor every second that you're looking at a thing, whether or not you're actually engaging with it.
Exactly. So before the rise of social media, mass media, specifically television, would rely on things called, I believe they were called Nielsen scores. And they
Mm-hmm.
were exactly what you talked about, that sample size. But they were a really rough estimate of what was keeping viewers' attention. Before we kind of had loose ideas and in a weird way, it allowed um, artistry and journalistic integrity to kind of flourish in certain ways. But with social media, I wouldn't call it a crude science at all. I'd call it a very precise science, especially I've had a lot of experience talking about. Um, so I have a lot of experience working with the Facebook ad system, running Facebook ads, and it's almost scary accurate how how well they process that data.
So the big thing that kind of came to my mind, and the older viewers, our older viewership will probably remember this, but the movie Network. So basically, the movie Network was a movie about a journalist who basically went effectively crazy and blew up on live TV, and instead of the individuals watching it understanding, hey, okay, we actually do need to do something about this. They the the network took this individual and mass produced it, and this kind of was the to me was the main conception of what would be presentation without engagement, because it doesn't matter what the person is saying, or what the actual content of the ad space, or of the attention grabbing thing is. It's whether or not it's actually grabbing the attention.
Absolutely. I think about the idea of grabbing attention first, neurologically, even. There's a couple people that I've watched on YouTube who talk about their strategies in grabbing attention. So, I mean, the obvious example is clickbait and listables, things that keep your eyes running to them and then running through those spaces longer. But additionally, the way human brains are wired, we are wired to respond faster and more often to things that upset us.
Mm.
So this, where previously we needed to keep attention if we were advertisers just long enough to run the ad during a well-selling show, now we need to find a way to compete with attention, compete for attention in a space that has billions of users additionally also advertising. And how do you do that is with increasingly more ridiculous pieces of media.
And it's kind of like, at least in the age of the algorithmic attention grabbing, it's almost as if what algorithms are attempting to optimize for is attention, but they have, unlike ratings and traditional forms of media, the algorithms are unable to find a way to stop themselves from optimizing.
Mm-hmm.
So, like you had kind of touched on earlier, the it's almost like the traditional media was about, mere attention grabbing for the duration of a segment, whereas modern social media is about monopolization of attention.
Absolutely. And a big part of the way they do it is through what I just talked about earlier, that sort of rewarding of clickbait type incendiary media just as a function of the algorithm. Another way that they do that is that these algorithms are built to addict you and to make you want to glue your eyes to
Mm-hmm.
whatever platform is using them. Um, and as a writer who's worked for a lot of things, I can tell you that my job was to optimize for that. Not only are these algorithms that are running these sites optimizing for it, but because that environment is now the norm, my job as a freelancer is to also optimize for the algorithm, which I think is very destructive.
The big thing that I kind of noticed is there's kind of this weird meta narrative when it comes to the movie, and it's almost like, hey, we're pointing out the hypocrisies of social media and the monopolization of attention, but we're also producing this on, or at least releasing this on a thing that benefits from that. And one thing that I kind of first thought was like, oh well, maybe it's just another thing. But when I dug a little deeper into it, it was kind of like, oh well, maybe is this basically counter economics or just a co-optation of the mass media, or well, the social media algorithm?
I think to a large extent it's the latter. When you view the film and you recognize that a platform like Netflix is also data mining and algorithm driven, and that it provides users with recommendations that at times can be very accurate due to that data mining. Um, but when you view the film, at the end of the film, they give you a few links to their. Some of the people featured in the film are leading companies who are trying to eliminate this problem or reduce this problem. And you'll notice that within those pages, they talk about why they may have a social media presence, why they may be using Netflix. And it's exactly that, that the people who need to hear that most are those who are using these social media platforms and sort of new mass media internet markets like Netflix.
And now, before we actually get too far into the nitty gritty of how your social media presence will affect things like careers or jobs, I do kind of want to touch more specifically on the idea of how social media has affected journalism. We keep bringing up the idea of clickbaits and how you need to constantly write for the algorithm, so to speak. And there is some on the left that have actually even decried my own show because I'm using Twitch, because Twitch is also a data mining social media platform. But it's almost as if, well, this is really the only thing that we currently have. And, I want to go more into that as we get into jobs, but, how do you think that social media has, either benefited or detracted from journalism, and what the modern journalist, in scare quotes, what that means for them.
Absolutely. So I don't study journalism specifically, but I do have a lot of experience in the field. And the reason that that is the social media platforms and the rise of getting our news through them has generated a need for lots and lots of articles to come out very, very quickly. And in the past, this wasn't happening. And the journalists that would work for these major or even minor news outlets had to adhere to certain journalistic standards of integrity in terms of not misleading people, making sure they do their research, things like that. But with this rise in demand for new content all of the time, the cheapest option and the most efficient option is to hire someone like me, who's a freelancer.
Mm-hmm.
And what these companies will do is they'll hire someone like me, usually at the starting level, to do some clickbait stuff, and then you can work your way up this sort of echelon from there. But they basically give you a topic, give you the touch points, and tell you how long it should be, give you all of these parameters that essentially force you to make articles a little more incendiary, to fit a narrative, and to fit the algorithm. And on top of that, someone like myself isn't held to those journalistic standards. So I could write something that is very skewed, very selectively truthful with the events, so that these companies make more profit, getting more clicks, more ads, and fake news spreads and is created a lot faster and a lot easier because of the way these algorithms have affected the industry.
And I kind of feel like we should mention the fact that it's not even just people presenting false information, because 9 times out of 10, these articles aren't necessarily lying. It's the fact that, you know, what was it, like something like 90% of people don't read past the headline. So
That's
what you do, what I would assume the modern writer that has been given these things, especially when it comes to when it comes to pandering to the algorithm, what they're doing is they're giving a tagline, an article headline that leads people to believe one thing or another, but in the actual article, it elaborates upon it. I think one of the big things is along the lines of like, oh well, with Netflix, for example, there was a situation where a couple weeks ago, there was some bad information going around about how the CEO of Netflix is arrested for pedophilia or something like that, and then what the actual headline was executives at Netflix under investigation for pedophilia. But when you actually read the article, it's, oh well, no, they're not actually under investigation for pedophilia. It was some senators or some representatives wrote a letter to the DOJ asking to look into a a potential child pornography situation, when it's not like actual child pornography. Like the big thing that came up was cuties, and it's not like, well, that's not actual child pornography or child abuse, but because of the outrage, because of the individuals not actually sitting down and critically engaging with their media, that just blew out of proportion.
exactly. I mean, even the potential headline you brought up, the sort of CEO being arrested or something like that for child pornography, that's a great example of something that's an outright lie that journalistic standards before, generally there would have been some repercussions in most instances. But even leaving that lie out, if I were commissioned to write that article and I want more jobs, the headline I might write is um, Netflix comes under fire via DOJ for promoting child pornography. So, under fire is a meaningless term.
Mm-hmm.
Saying the DOJ is involved is factual. And promoting child pornography is an opinion that is currently being looked into, whether that film was child pornography or not. But the fact that I put that headline there, you're now seeing through articles like this, people leaving, people on the right, especially QAnon people, canceling their Netflix subscriptions en masse just by that very misleading headline. When in reality, all it was a handful of government officials saying, "Hey, can you look and see if this might be classified as child pornography, and if so, what should we do about it?"
And I think the idea of clickbait articles, or even just reading past the headline, not even reading past the headline, is also not just something that was brought about by the algorithm and the nature of social media, but also this now 24-hour news cycle. It's like there is, whereas in traditional media there was always a 24-hour break, a 12-hour break, an 8-hour break between when you got your news, but now it's always. You're able to constantly have the news at your fingertips, and either the people who are consuming these articles either expect new articles every 5-10 minutes because they're trying to find a way to fill the void that is their life, or they have become so accustomed to constantly chasing that next dopamine high that they're always trying to find something new to get outraged at, something new to be concerned about, something new to be mad about.
Or even to be the most knowledgeable person about. You know, when breaking news happens, we get Google alerts, we get it in our social media feeds pretty much in minutes from the event. And as that goes, a lot of people will constantly look for new information so that they're the smart guy in the room, which is another version of that dopamine hit. So it also, that aspect of it, that sort of continuous update of breaking news, makes it very easy for misinformation to spread that way as well. Because, I mean, early developing stories have lots and lots of misunderstood information or rumors that get made into news, and because of the demand to be the first to have that story, both on the reader part and on the writer part, I think it's very likely that false facts essentially get printed online far more often. And at a certain point, you go, I know what's going on, and you shut it down when that story is still developing for the next 3 days.
And I think that's actually really interesting, because one of the things that I've tried to do, at least in my show, is I try to because of the nature of me doing this on a weekly basis, I have time to compile sources. I have time to compile what might actually be going on. Um, at least in the similar manner that I would have if I was writing a research paper for my degree in college. But even so, like, we have these protests that have been going on for as of the recording 116 days. And this is something that is still going on, but yet we don't see that in mass media as frequently anymore. Or the biggest thing that kind of comes to mind is where if something's happening, everybody goes to Twitter. And whereas a journalist traditionally would use something like Twitter, which would traditionally have been the Associated Press, and then use that to find leads into our news, people are taking Twitter news sources as the de facto, this is exactly what's happening right now. We know everything that's happening.
And especially with those protests, in the States, anyone who's politically minded is talking about them. And with that, a large number of those people have agendas. And it becomes very, very easy, if you want to write these clickbait articles, to simply search a term, base it on location so that you're getting something, for example, from within Portland. And if you're on the right, you can pick out 30, 40 tweets that can be construed as inherently violent, terroristic, maybe, depending on how you write the article. And if you're on the left, you could do the exact same thing with the exact same protests. And those so-called like on-the-ground accounts aren't vetted at all. They're just something someone said online.
Exactly.
Really.
Exactly.
Sort of feeds into itself, really.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things, like, the movie kind of focused more on the millennial and the Gen Z generations. But there is also something to be said about how this 24 news cycle and the advent of having news at your fingertips all the time, or at least things that could be construed as news all the time, and their effect on the Boomer generation and the Gen X generation, who are very used to the traditional journalistic integrity. This is something that happened 2 days ago, and we looked into it, and this is what we know. Whereas now it's like we said, like it's people who are on the ground, just some random person who hasn't been vetted and doesn't really have a history. I mean, mind you, there are journalists on the ground that are doing the best that they can to maintain that journalistic integrity, but at the same time, there is no further research beyond, hey, this is what's happening right now.
Well, not only that, for Gen X and Boomers especially, uh, the platforms themselves and these algorithms, especially when I look at Facebook, which is Gen X and Boomers are their main demographic, provides things with a sense of authority. A Facebook page with a sufficient banner that calls itself a news agency is a news agency. So the design itself allows for this sense of authority for pretty much anyone. And then on top of that, these algorithms drive their users to consume more of what they're interested in and in a more extreme way, because that keeps people coming back. So with this combination of sort of supposed authority from largely anyone, and these algorithms driving people sort of deeper into a rabbit hole, which I think is actually a phrase that's brought up a lot in the documentary, you see a lot of fake news being accepted whole cloth because most people get most of their news from their social media, and these algorithms are driving them towards sources, toward groups, toward pages that may not be legitimate, but will definitely get people to continue to watch.
And kind of as a side note, before we move on to the next question, I do kind of want to point out that our generation, or more specifically, the millennial and the Gen Z generations, have come in contact with firsthand not knowing how to handle people who are being dishonest on the internet. Whereas Gen X, and Boomers don't really have that kind of skill set. So they do accept things that seem legitimate as whole cloth without looking deeper, because they're used to the news, so to speak, be something that has to be, poured in, have time poured into to find out the truth.
Well, and not only that, which is funny in itself, I actually recently had to have a serious discussion with my grandmother about the fact that you cannot believe everything you read on the internet, which is such a funny concept for someone like you or I, who has spent a large portion of their lives with this tool, who knows that anyone can put anything anywhere. But on top of that, and specifically for Gen X and Boomers, so specifically talking about Facebook, this works for Twitter as well, really. The way that these articles spread is, yes, through the pages, but also people you trust are showing them to you. Your friends are sharing these to you, so you trust your friends, you trust the authority that seems correct there, and then you read it, and it doesn't seem like they're still writers writing them, professional writers. It seems put together, there's a narrative, and everyone seems to agree because you've been forced into this echo chamber by these algorithms. So the whole system kind of intentionally or unintentionally, very insidiously makes it very easy for fake news to be very, very believable, especially for people who don't critically consume media on the internet.
And we keep mentioning about internet as a tool, but one of the biggest things that it's kind of become the hammer that we're beaten with, because when I was going through college, one of the biggest things that I had to deal with was, if you want to get a job, you write a resume, you send it out to 100 people. But as I'm getting more and more into the field, and as I get further and further from college, the more and more I find that that there is a inherent need to have a social media presence if you want to get a job in any field.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of people online who are kind of well into their career fields, 10, 15, 20 years, are recommending that. But from the perspective of someone currently finishing up a degree and as such recently graduated high school, this idea is part of the curriculum now. The idea that not only do you have to have a professional social media presence, um, that you have to engage with social media very consistently so that you have the right kind of social media presence. And you have to divide your life into your private social media, your public social media, how to use it to get a job. And if you don't have social media, the belief is you're going to have a very hard time getting a job because it's expected.
And now I do kind of want for our viewers, I do kind of want to make a distinction between what we're discussing and what is traditionally or colloquially known as operational security or OPSEC. Um, Especially I believe that especially my viewer base is a base that would understand what it means to be OPSEC. But for those who may just be tuning in, not really knowing not really coming in from places like Telegram, where I tend to base my operations. Operational security is effectively being able to hide yourself on the internet, and that doesn't mean hiding your online persona, but keeping your online persona and your real life persona entirely disparate. And the difference between operational security and what Tyler is talking about is that the it's not like when you're trying to keep the private account and the business account separate, it's because you don't want to have something, you don't want to say something on your private account and have that associated with your business account and cost you a job. Whereas operational security is more of you don't want to you don't, because you're in certain groups, you don't want to be found out by the wrong people and be harassed or potentially targeted.
And to add on to that, not only is so the way we're taught to use social media when we're talking about a professional social media presence is so far opposite of OPSEC, not only in that you are intentionally connecting this account, this content that you're providing on that account with your real life self, it's almost taught or recommended to be not only a form of networking, which I think is the best use of social media, but almost an insidious type of resume where you're presenting a version of yourself that is the ideal employee, but you also want to make it seem like this is where you spend your time. This is the natural place for you to spend your time. So you're trying to present an image to employers that the totality of who you are is this account that you've crafted to look very good to employers that you have to spend time engaging with to make it look natural rather than just here's my LinkedIn, here's my resume. Things like Twitter in my industry are very, very big. And you have to keep those pages running so that it looks like that's who you are. And I find that really odd and troubling.
Well, not only is it troubling in that you're almost manipulating any future interaction that you have with employers or potential customers, and I use customers in the very loosest sense.
Yeah, for me, it really is customers.
Um, but also you're kind of forced into using these conglomerates that are going to be selling your information to advertisers, and it's almost like you're being forced into buying a product. And we kind of as a tangent, we've recently seen on the right people kind of railing against things like the ACA because, oh, well, the government can't force us to buy a product. But at the same time, we're reaching a dystopian nightmare where you are fundamentally being forced to purchase a product.
These algorithms drive your attention and what you see online to the point where your knowledge about a diversity of products, a diversity of viewpoints, and viewpoints as products become so limited that you're not able to actually make the conscious choice, the sort of free market choice that the right wing really wants to have. And the worst part is you don't realize it.
And I think that's actually a really good point to kind of segue into my next question with when the algorithm is basically so much about optics. I have seen very much so on the left kind of a loss or a de-radicalization on the left because, you know, one of the biggest things when I'm reading theory and when I'm looking back on leftist history, you know, in the 1880s to the 1920s, you know, a union was a group of people that got together with their guns and basically stormed the house of the boss and said, "You give us what we need, or we're going to shoot you." And now a union is writing a firmly worded letter to the boss and threatening not to work.
It's primarily someone very close to me is very involved in a large union, and even this kind of large, powerful union in the area that I'm in, they're primarily collective bargaining and strongly worded letters, as you said. It's essentially the people you go to make sure your contract is nice. And that de-radicalization, without putting a value judgment on it, is, like you said, incentivized by appearances, because when you look at the left and you look at the right, both take a moral stance, and both in opposition to the other. The left's moral stance in opposition to the right is that they're not mean and nasty.
Yes.
So in order to not be mean and nasty, in order to have that duality, the right, because they're saying, "Oh, we're truth tellers," will be more mean and nasty over time, and the left will be more and more accepting of more center or even right views over time, so as not to offend, to preserve that image. I think.
And it's almost like on the other end of the spectrum, on the right, because they're so. I guess the best word would be cliquey, because they're so focused on excluding individuals. They've become more radicalized. And I'm not saying that there hasn't always been a terrorist streak on the right, but it's become to a point where even the most quote unquote normie of rightists are now looking at protesters and being like, "Well, just fucking run them over."
Absolutely. I mean, even people in my own life who I think of as as long as I've known them, as very reasonable, level-headed, even-tempered people who, for the most part, up until the last few years, were very center-right, very openly talk about, "Oh, yeah, I definitely shoot protesters. I think that people are fine to run them over." A large part of that is also this idea on the right that I don't know really when it took root, but I know that it's very prevalent, that associating the left with anything, if you're going to associate the left with anything, it's going to be criminality, violence, terrorism, and a big trope is mental illness.
Yes.
Whereas on the left, they view the right often as bigoted, controlling, and a lot of bad things for the country, but not bad things, not bad people in themselves. And that narrative of the left represents moral depravity in all of these various forms makes the right view the people on the left as issues, whereas the left views the ideas on the right, for the most part, outside of those in power, as the issue. And that, I think, really contributes to this radicalization into violence on the right that's a lot less, much less prevalent on the left.
And it's almost as if as the right becomes more radicalized and more violent and more accusatory of the left, there's a subsect of the left that basically tries to prove to the right or prove to the centrists that, oh, well, no, we're not criminals. We're not all violent. We're not all morally depraved. And it's almost as if they're walking on eggshells to convince people to join their side.
I would also say that A large narrative on the right is the sort of unity of ideals, and that kind of contributes to the narrative that they have, where they say the
Mm-hmm.
left is eating themselves. So when we talk about people who are center left, who are socialist democratic, who are leftists, that's all different stripes who do argue with each other, and that's, I think, part of that walking on eggshells is not only do they walk on eggshells to cater to center right folks,
Mm-hmm.
they walk on it for each other, and that further contributes to this narrative. And because dividing things into a strong, unified left with certain ideals, and then all of these different subsects, a strong, unified right with all of these ideals, and all of these different subsects of anything to the left of them, it further contributes to this sort of narrative that the left is eating itself and the right is strong. And on top of that, it incentivizes a further unification on the right to that strength because that's where they find their value, and a further diversification and walking on eggshells aspect in the left because that's those subsects' values. So the system, these systems, these algorithms, and the people who write them have created an environment where those problems perpetuate further simply by existing in themselves online.
And then we have another subsect of the left, which is sitting down and, almost embracing that ideation of what the right sees it as, or even embracing rightist tendencies towards things like treating individuals as inferior, or using slurs or things like that, just to win over the far right, to be like, oh yeah, no, we're cool too, not every one of us is walking on eggshells. And it almost kind of detracts from it when you fully embrace it, instead of it's almost as a reaction to the reaction of walking on eggshells.
As an unfortunate consequence to all of that, as we talked about earlier, all of these different people have individual social media presences who are advertising their particular brand of left that the right can then go in and see these people who are either like what's called dirt bag left, and say, these people are exactly who we think. Or they'll pick out someone like you just talked about who's like, yeah, no, let's buddy up to the further right and do some of the things that they say we're uncomfortable with. And that those same outlets might say, well, look, the left are hypocrites. This is a leftist. The left is a monolithic thing, just like we on the right are. And these people are hypocrites. We're obviously morally superior.
And then there's a third way, joke, joke, joke. No, I'm seriously joking. Please don't think that I'm a Nazi. There is a third subset of the left, which is basically just attempting to live their lives, so to speak. Yeah, there's going to be individuals that are going to use slurs or use language that individuals would find uncomfortable, but they don't do it as a reaction to those trying to walk on eggshells. It's just the majority of the working class, and I say this as a working class individual, the majority of the working class does tend towards the what the walking on eggshells left would consider rightist language.
Well, and not only that, the very idea of vulgarity, which when we talk about problematic words or slurs or things like that, that's really a subset of vulgarity. And vulgarity, from its inception, at least in the English language, comes from the working class. Vulgarity has always been the language of the working class. And the unfortunate reality for those individuals who just want to live their lives and might not do the right thing according to the far left or the far right or anybody, those people, when they start politically defining themselves online, these algorithms want them to get more intensely into where they're at. So what happens with these sort of, I guess, average Joes who happen to hold political opinions is the sites that they're on, the algorithms, because they respond to view, which is driven by being upset, forces them deeper into these rabbit holes where they may not have the luxury of just enjoying having their opinion and living their lives. because it's being forced on them, so they continue to watch.
At the risk of being canceled,
Mm-hmm.
there is the big thing that kind of pops up to my mind is where you take the rejection of vulgarity to such an extreme where you even start censoring very common words like woman because
Yeah, I've seen
it has the word man in it. Like, I understand where you're coming from. I understand the idea of trying to break of the social norms and the patriarchy to an extent where you're trying to create a new dialect that is more inclusive. But by doing that, you are inherently alienating the working class, which is the very essence of what the left is fighting for.
exactly, and I think the sort of manipulation of language is something that's done on the left and the right, but it's particularly focused on in the left, and the right focuses on that tendency, because there's a strong contingent of redefining language, which language is fluid. There's nothing really wrong with that, but attempting to redefine language, and that for traditionalists on the right is extraordinarily scary
Mm-hmm.
because language to them is part of identity.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but the one thing that I've always found the further right you go is the more prescriptive in language you go.
Absolutely. Which I think is unfortunate. The other thing that I've found, the further right you go, I will not say that. Never mind. Um, good joke, wrong setting. But good joke, wrong setting is exactly what language is. Language is simply either the mouth sounds or the little block shapes that we use to convey meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And as meaning changes and understanding of words changes, language changes with it. And this intentional attempt to change language may be good or bad, but it's not necessarily wrong. So the left does understand that. I think part of the left, definitely a large contingent of the left, does understand that our words have power and our associations with those words have power. But that's not quite a thing on the right. So
Mm-hmm.
they see these changing words and they think they're changing who we are as a speaking, writing population. They're trying to redefine how I can think, and they inevitably go into well, George Orwell did talk about this.
Yeah,
Um,
with doublespeak and the removal of words to control mental states.
he called it newspeak.
Newspeak, yes, thank you.
Yes. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on what you were meaning by that.
So there is kind of a current in linguistics that language influences thought. And George Orwell very explicitly tried to express this in 1984 in the fact that the authoritarian regime effectively was trying to control thought by controlling language. Because if you can't express a certain feeling or a certain idea, then that idea ceases to effectively exist materially.
And there is some evidence to back that up.
Mm-hmm.
There's a South American tribe. I wish I could remember the name of it, but they don't have language for abstract concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, if I were a member of this tribe speaking in my language to you, the moment that you hang up the phone, you no longer exist to me. There's no concept of past, future, or anything
Mm-hmm.
like that. So there is an element of truth to that. However, because social media drives alarmism, people are taking, both on the left and the right, things that, uh, you know, either let's take your example, the censoring of woman.
Mm-hmm.
The right sees the left doing that and don't understand that that's just a collection of individuals whose accounts and posts have been picked out and presented to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a massive shift in language. And the left doesn't quite grasp that the intentional changing of language is a very dangerous thing to do. And while I think it's all well intentioned, at times it can have negative consequences. But the further driving of outrage allows that practice to go on more and more and more. If you see 1,000 people in your newsfeed a day being offended and having an argument for why they should be offended by the word woman, you're going to be more likely to also decide to censor the word woman, even if that's not something you would have ordinarily thought of or accepted yourself.
Yeah. So coming off this idea of, not everything is so monolithic, I think we kind of want to dive right into the dramumentary is what I'm going to call it.
It's a great word for it.
Yeah. The individuals that are being interviewed for the documentary are presenting social media and are presenting the algorithms as things that are very monolithic. Things that, especially in our modern conception of how corporations exist legally as persons, we don't perceive the individuals that drive the decisions the corporation will make. And one of the things that I kind of noticed is that the first thing that they brought up was, oh, well, if Google is doing this, or Twitter does that, or Facebook does this, and it's like, no, the executives and board members at these companies are making these decisions that lead towards these actions being made.
And not only that, like, even those people are making those decisions that are leading toward those actions being made, but then there's additional accountability down the line, proportionally as you go, where, so let's say Mark Zuckerberg makes a decision, the board of directors agrees. The next step is someone has to build these algorithms. Teams have to test them, review them, check how they're working, make sure that they're still working so that their site doesn't go down. There's so many different checks that are propping up these systems that it isn't just Facebook that's doing it. It's the collections of individuals running Facebook or Twitter or whatever particular algorithm-driven social media that you use.
When you're comparing it, one of the biggest things that comes to mind when it comes to monoliths is the idea that, oh, protesters are this, or people who say defund the police mean this, or so many other things that basically, what's the word? They reduce the ideas that are driving these movements into such monolithic entities that it totally ignores the fact that these are movements of individual people making decisions.
I think the aspect of these algorithms incentivizing quick clickbait articles and headlines, the character limits on Twitter, the way that we communicate information, it's much more accurate to say this number of people gathered and this was a collection of things they protested about. However, it's much faster to spread and much easier to have an emotional reaction to the words the protesters or the police or the right or the left. Not only does social media drive this movement toward like monolithicization, if I can say that word, we'll never be able to say it again. It drives us to conceptualize that way ourselves and rewards it because everything we're seeing does so and confirms that, oh, this must be the right way to talk about it.
So the movie kind of juxtaposes these interviews with almost a dramedy, because it's almost laughable at how dystopic it is. And one thing that kind of came to mind was like, oh, this is just a Black Mirror episode embedded in a documentary. So much so that it's like they take what they're trying to say that are the fears of social media and drive it to an 11.
Absolutely, and I think there's a very good reason for that. As a writer viewing the documentary, I'm sorry, what was the word you used?
What?
What was the word you used for the film? Not a documentary, but a
dramumentary.
Yes, the dramumentary. We have to consider, when we talked earlier about the reasons this collection of people who worked on this drama the film, would release it and work with Netflix, even though Netflix is an example of the very thing they're working against.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of alarmist, dystopian, almost silly thing to us, they're trying to reach a specific group of people, which is why they released it on Netflix, which is why they have this online presence the way they do at all. And the specific group of people that the movie is targeting is not someone like you or I who tries to critically consume media, who tries to be aware of what they're looking at online and how they spend their time online. They're looking at the people who can afford to pay for a Netflix subscription, which mostly is Gen Xers and boomers, and people who most need that information, which is Gen Xers and boomers, really.
Yeah.
So to overblow this issue that is something you or I see as almost obvious, and we've just gotten a little bit more information about it, this may be a totally new concept to them. And displaying it in these very dramatic terms, which makes it very easy to understand to a broad audience. It's centered on the family unit. There's different examples and characters for the different ways people use social media, almost to a laughable caricature extent. And that's very helpful in illustrating these ideas to someone who might not be tech savvy or who might not have even thought about, oh, Facebook and Twitter and whatever chooses what I see on my timeline. I had no idea. I thought I saw it when it was posted. I think it's a very helpful tool that makes it silly to us, but it's an important tool.
And it's also very interesting. One of my biggest critiques, and I think this is just like you said, it's the byproduct of being the focus group being, boomers and Gen Xers, is that they're not actually showing how social media affects those groups of people, like we've mentioned before, at least in terms of fake news and getting bad news sources. But it focuses on how it affects the millennial generation and the Gen Zs, because the main characters of the drama side of the documentary are the children. It's two daughters and a son. The oldest sister, who is kind of like the way I kind of conceptualized her, is she's like what would be considered the bridge between the generational gap, because she doesn't necessarily use social media, but she knows what social media is, and she has an idea of how to appropriately use it. Then we have the son, who is what I would call the antagonist, because he's the victim. And I call him the antagonist because he is the thing that becomes the antagonizer of the Gen X and the boomers, the thing that they want to demonize.
I think this is where you and I might differ quite a bit, because also within the film, I would hesitate to even call them characters, but there's personifications of the different sides of these algorithms that are really based on what these experts have to say about them. And I think those are set up as the primary victimizers and the primary antagonists, because they're the cause of the son's victimization, and they're set up to be seen as ultra controlling, ultra manipulative, that this poor son who, we also have to remember, he may have been going down in this film the road to radicalization. He, at the time of his entering a protest, at the time of his arrest, he hadn't actually done anything. They made it
spoilers, by the way.
At the time of the arrest at this protest, they made a very intentional choice to have him simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, to make him almost a martyr or the most innocent victim to this algorithm. And by doing that, it allows people to feel that their beliefs aren't being targeted. This is obviously just some poor kid. Look at what these algorithms that we get to see faces on and see talking. Look at them drive him to these things that we're set up to believe are the worst in the drama side.
That's a fair point. So then we finally have the youngest daughter, who the way that I kind of conceptualize her is she's the what we would traditionally see as the victim of social media, the girl who's bullied, the girl who eventually becomes depressed because of her interaction with social media, the one that is being very what's the word, she's being controlled into believing that her natural state is wrong because a couple people on the internet said so.
I would additionally say that she sort of represents the way we talk about kids online in traditional media, and the way that we talk about these older generations worry about kids being online, where I don't think there's a single moment in the film where she's not engaging with social media to the point where she can't interact with the world around her.
The scene that comes to mind is where the mom, I think halfway through the drama side, is like, oh well, you guys all need to stop using your phones at the dinner table, and puts it into a locked Tupperware container, which I don't even know where she got the Tupperware container in the first place and why it was locked, but whatever. Where the youngest daughter is so arguably addicted to her social media that she goes ahead and breaks the Tupperware container just to get to her phone.
Pretty violently. I mean, she damages the phone, the other phones in the process. I think she does it with a hammer, and it's only within like 10 minutes of her not having her phone, which again plays into the sort of comical side for you and I, but another audience, say, somebody's grandma who doesn't talk to her grandchildren anymore when they're there because they're on their phones, is like, yes, this is exactly it. This is what we've been talking about. And that setting her up to be the main victim allows the actual victim, the son, to be seen a lot more clearly, because he represents the behaviors of most social media users. But I think we haven't really gotten into his engagement with social media yet.
Because we have touched on what the documentary side of the dramumentary has touched on mostly in the previous sections, I do kind of want to focus in on the drama side of the dramumentary. In that, so it starts off with a very typical family, 2.5 kids, white picket fence, the American dream, so to speak.
Because I think it's literally a white picket fence.
The first scene is the oldest daughter talking to the mom about, oh, well, social media is this bad thing. We need to keep an eye on it, kind of thing. And the next scene, which I always thought was one of the most hilarious bits of the entire drama side, was where the son's watching a bit by The View, where Oprah Winfrey's like, you need to put your phones down right now and watch us. And it's like he's watching it on his phone. That's just...
yeah.
That's perfect dramatic irony right there. But then as it expands, we kind of see how the son interacts initially with social media, which is how social media traditionally is viewed as. The idea of a kind of an augmented reality to connect further with your social groups.
And then from there, before he changes his use of social media, we begin to see how the social media platforms themselves, the algorithms themselves, change the way he interacts with social media.
Yeah.
Through no fault of his own. He truly, in his mind, is engaging in a very healthy way. He's socializing, he's clubs and sports, all the, again, American dream son things to do, and he's using social media to keep up with his friends, to make plans, and to see what's going on. And then we switch to this view of him suspended as a puppet, or a representation of him, and we've got the 3 algorithm figures.
Which the main kind of underline is as he interacts with the algorithm more, that puppet, that representation of him becomes more and more defined. Mm-hmm. Like it starts off with as a lifeless gray individual, right? And then slowly until the end of the drama side, it is literally him. Well, not literally, but like it is such a close approximation of him that is nearly indistinguishable from who he is.
Yes, and we get to see this very good analogy for how these algorithms work, and that they're tracking his eye time, they're tracking all of these different things, and pushing things into his feed, into his notifications to continue to get him further and further invested. But we start to see him using his phone in class more often than paying attention, and further monopolizing his attention by manipulating what he sees and what his devices are giving him.
And it's actually kind of ironic because we talked earlier about the monolithization of these situations, but the drama side of the dramatary utilizes this monolithization by kind of conglomerating all apps that the Sun would use as, oh well, this is the representation of the algorithm. Mm-hmm. The main qualm that I had was that all of these push notifications aren't coming from the same thing, or at least in the drama side, it is all the same social media. But in a realistic sense, it's less, just all Facebook, but it's Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, YouTube, Twitch, Vimeo, Telegram, Discord. It's such a wide array of applications that are drawing the attention that there isn't a single application that is that has the monopoly on the attention.
Though I think all of them are fighting to gain that monopoly. There is that understanding.
Oh, definitely.
When I wake up in the morning, I have 10 notifications from Facebook. 100% of them, realistically, I don't care about it. I have 10 from Twitter. I have a couple, like maybe 4 from Instagram. I even, unfortunately, downloaded TikTok recently. I get a TikTok notification about every hour, and not to mention the messages and things. And the way we engage with social media is, what if that's important?
Yeah.
The sort of idea that in the documentary, in the film, they talk about the sort of constant dopamine reuptake or reintake as you refresh a feed, or as you see yourself tagged or mentioned, or just new information is given to you. And those push notifications help fuel that literally first thing in the morning, when you have all of the options of what's going to take your interest right now and in what order.
So as we kind of move through the drama side, after it's been established how the algorithm functions, what they optimize for, and how a traditional teenager or young adult would use social media, we then have a situation where the mom and the older daughter to a lesser extent challenges the son to not use the phone for a whole week because the screen's been shattered. We'll pay for the screen to get fixed if you don't use it for a whole week.
A fun little challenge, really.
Yeah, which typically, if we didn't have an algorithm that had a halting problem for optimization, it would be no big deal. But at least the characterization of the algorithm shows this halting problem, shows this optimization, and effectively goes, we need his attention. How do we find his attention? And it turns almost sinister. Not even almost sinister, it does turn sinister. Because they even... The way that they call him back is a notification that his ex got a new boyfriend.
Which went down in months through his previous activity and data to try and make it the most alarming thing that they could possibly come up with for him.
Whereas pre the algorithm, that kind of information would be like, oh, cool, good for her.
Well, it may not have been that, but it definitely would have not been presented, sort of handed to you on a platter.
Yeah.
Before these algorithms, you would have had to, the internet, a lot of the social side of the internet functioned essentially as word of mouth. You wouldn't have heard about it until much later.
Yeah, if at all.
If at all. But by shoving that, I actually had almost the exact same experience in the exact same circumstances, where I had been through a breakup fairly recently. I had been taking a break from social media, and I happened to get on, and the first thing on my feed was that my most recent ex had gotten into a relationship. Um, that wasn't an unrealistic example. Um, but ordinarily, without that platform, I might have, 2, 3, 4 months down the road, if I ever heard about it, gotten a phone call or gotten a text or gotten a message or happened to be on a feed.
Or
Looked
best
for
case
that
scenario,
information.
bumped into her on the street and be like, "Oh, this is a new boyfriend." Where
Exactly.
it would be because it would have been presented in a social setting where it wouldn't have been alarming. It would have been like, "Oh, well, that kind of sucks because I." At the worst case scenario, well, that kind of sucks. I still had feelings for you. But best case scenario, would be like, "Oh, okay, we left on
We
mutual terms. That's great. I'm glad to see you. I'm glad to see you're moving on."
It highlights so well how much mental distress in the form of being alarmed or incensed
Mm-hmm.
is how these algorithms optimize time on these apps. To take something and the personification of these algorithms do it intentionally to alarm and upset him, knowing that when he's alarmed and upset, he will further engage with what they're trying to engage with.
Which is
Um,
actually an interesting point, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but I kind of want to move to how the when he had actively engaged with social media, it was very benign things. Oh, hey, check out this girl that's in your class. She kind of likes you. She liked your photo, kind of thing. Very benign things. But as soon as he stopped social media, and the first thing that got him back was this alarmist situation, they optimized for that because that's what drew
yes,
his attention.
it learned that immediately, oh, this thing that alarmed him created far more attention in the last, just speaking of it in like data, far more attention than anything else has in the last 5 days or so.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can do it that way, just do more of that. So you start showing a lot of different ways for people to be alarmed until they engage with the next thing that alarms them and engages them.
Mm-hmm.
And the machine learns, okay, this is how we get eyes on screens to sell ads predictably.
And it's actually really interesting because what makes the shift sinister is not that they're seeking the monopoly of attention. It's that the monopoly of attention that the method that they're seeking the monopoly of attention after the shift draws him away from his more immediate social circles that he used to be engaged with. And one of the biggest things that kind of drove that was the when he wasn't using social media, he kind of found a rift because he wasn't able to engage with his peers in the same way.
It became almost impossible for him to socialize, really,
Mm-hmm.
because how do you, uh, just speaking from someone who's probably best represented in him, I don't really know how I would make the plans or the arrangements that I do with people without these devices and without, in many cases, these platforms that are algorithm driven. We don't have those tools anymore
Mm-hmm.
because we were raised pretty much from right when we started understanding how to use the internet with these algorithm driven platforms. So it it really starts to highlight the two-edged sword of social media. It provides a lot of social benefit, in that we can do what these things are supposed to do. We can connect, but at the same time, it's getting harder to connect without them. It's getting
Mm-hmm.
harder to move away from them. And when you are connecting using them, it pushes you down areas of attention that will keep you alarmed, upset, and engaged with these.
And one of the biggest things is that um, his isolation from being unable to use the apps is then furthered by his own self isolation after the shift. Um, like we even see that in the interaction with his older sister, where she's constantly trying to be like, "Hey, what's going on with soccer?" And then he's on his phone, kind of thing. And that kind of brings me to a point that I want to kind of discuss how the algorithm is is constantly, and we've been touching on this all the entire interview about how it's the success of dopamine highs versus kind of, for those who have read more theory on the left, an autopoiesis of ideas, an autopoiesis of social standing, right? Where a natural viral understanding of an idea. Um, and I think the main difference is that, social media seeks an addiction, whereas an autopoietic idea seeks an understanding.
I would say not only an understanding, but an element of validity,
Yes.
for something to be self-perpetuating and keep keep a life as an idea for so long. It has to hold water, or at least seem to.
Mm-hmm.
But the dopamine highs don't need any of that. It's We've been talking a lot about the way we the way the son is using social media to socialize with his friends and as an augmented reality. And we've been talking about this rabbit holing of the left and the right. But the dopamine highs aren't exclusive to hanging out with your friends offline or politics. These dopamine highs are whatever you're interested in, and these algorithms want you to keep having them. So if you get online with a certain amount of interest, the algorithm reinforces continuing intensifying of that interest in order to keep you coming back for those dopamine highs. It might not be politics your friend group, it might be a book club online.
Mm-hmm.
The more you're given rewards by this algorithm, these dopamine highs over and over because of this behavior, the more you're going to need to function.
Which is actually interesting because pre-algorithm internet, such as BB boards and forums and even MySpace as the precursor to Facebook, they kind of it was all through word of mouth. It was all through, oh, I have this interest. Let me try to look up this interest on the internet, and finding a wider world of interest that you eventually find yourself in. Whereas the post algorithm internet is very much so, I'm going to optimize for these interests because it's what draws your attention.
Yeah, I think when we look at especially something like MySpace or message boards, before these algorithms, which I think really took root with Facebook and to a certain extent YouTube, we see the difference between the internet being used as a tool to facilitate communication and spreading of ideas, whether they were accurate or worthwhile, doesn't matter. It was used as a tool by people, and they touch on this in the documentary side as well, to these platforms being tools for the behavior modification of other people, whether that was the intent or not.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than making choices based on your interests, these tools are helping drive what your interests ought to be.
And in a kind of a sense, you brought up YouTube. One of the biggest things that I've noticed when it comes to YouTube is that these algorithms are almost destroying creativity. And I'm not saying that there isn't creative endeavors on YouTube, but if you look at YouTube, it feels like the most popular things are all very similar, if not completely alike.
I've heard from creators on YouTube often the sentiment that the best way to make money on YouTube, which is the incentive for a lot of people who want to create on YouTube, the best way to do it is to look at the most popular thing or the five most popular videos and go, how do I make almost the exact same video? How do I
Mm-hmm.
optimize for this algorithm to make people go, oh, the trend right now is Among Us, among gamers. How do I make 80 Among Us videos with everybody else
Yeah.
so that somebody watches my content?
And it's actually really interesting because the the way that I've kind of dichotomized the pre and post algorithm internet is that the pre algorithm internet was very individualized. It was very much so about, oh, look at this website that I made, or, oh, hey, I have I have a message board account that has this avatar and this signature, and I post in this and this sub forum. Whereas the post algorithm internet is they kind of sterilize that. So like if we look at Facebook and Twitter, for example, and even to a lesser extent YouTube, it's very much more of the same in terms of people's pages. It,
Absolutely.
it's
Uh,
not yeah, you can tweak them through, you still have the avatar and the banner, and you can customize your bio, but unlike in MySpace, if you go to a person's profile on Facebook, it looks like somebody else's profile. If you blot out the names and the pictures, it looks exactly the same.
yeah, and it's funny. I was in like elementary school and MySpace was around, and I wasn't allowed to have one. But I've been learning a lot about how MySpace functioned as a facilitation of social interaction online. And with those
Mm.
profiles, you think of something like the website Pimp My Profile that made sure that your cursor turned into a snake and everything
A
was made of
flaming
glitter.
sword, yeah.
Right, and everything's made of glitter and songs are playing. It was very personal, but also that sort of individualization allowed communities and art collectives to form really readily.
Yes.
Um, I came up in a lot of the like scene emo music stuff, and a lot of the ways that was done was on MySpace and these small communities forming for people to gather the things that they like because somebody told them about it. And now, being still involved in music and things like that, I look at how bands are trying to come up on things like Facebook, and it's there is no sense of community. It's about the views. It's about making sure that people are drawing attention and hoping that out of sort of like how you talked about the way you got jobs. Send out 100 resumes, hope a few come back. So it's sort of flipped into that, where instead of creating a community, it's if I put my band in front of 10,000 eyes, eventually two people will like it,
Yeah.
and we'll just keep doing that. And that's killing the creativity because how do you get 10,000 eyes to see it? Well, you make it something that's trendy.
And it's actually really interesting, at least in a business sense, or at least in a business sense for my show. Like the best way that I can monetize my show is to pay for a Facebook ad that's going to promise that I get 5% ROI on 20,000 people for $20. But that's not. But is that going to engage the individuals that are watching the show, or is it just going to be like, oh, hey, that's cool, let me like it?
And on the other end, if you if you want to stop supporting a system like Facebook that lets you run those ads and get however many people actually consistently watching, you have no choice but to rely on donations. How do you get enough donations to get a page running correctly or enable you to get your word out? People have to know about it at the outset. And
Mm-hmm.
what other tool do we have at this point to get whatever we're working on in front of a lot of people, get a lot of attention on it very quickly? And I'm not sure that there is one right now.
It's almost like the dilemma of, so I listen to Cortex. Shout out to CGP Grey, who may be a lib, but I don't fucking know yet. Um, in his podcast Cortex, he was discussing with another YouTube creator about Google Docs and how the other creator was trying to find something that functions similar to Google Docs because Google bad, but they
Google
couldn't
bad.
find
Yeah,
it. They couldn't find it because Google Docs is the best at what it does.
absolutely. Um, and I run into that problem in my own field as well. Like there are platforms out there for writers and for freelance writers specifically that are very effective. But if I want the fact that I'm selling a service to get in front of 10,000 people tomorrow, I'm not going anywhere else except for Facebook and Twitter because
Mm-hmm.
there's no other way to do it. You're exactly right that some of these technologies come from less than optimal sources, but are the optimal choice to accomplish your goal.
Because it's like I've been called a hypocrite for using Twitch, for example, because data mining and what have you. But at the same time, I don't have the resources to host my own video server, my own streaming server. I don't have the income to do so, and it's also going to be harder for me to reach an audience in the modern era of the internet.
Exactly. I've often also been thinking about the way we use the internet as a whole. We may
Mm.
be spending a lot more time on it, but we're seeing much, much less of it. In that most of our time on the internet is spent on sites like Twitch or Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And that sort of, I think the algorithm plays into that as well. Because you're getting these dopamine highs constantly from these sites, you're incentivized to go there for everything that you could possibly think of rather than go anywhere else.
Mm.
So for you to say, okay, let's assume you do have the resources to pay a web designer and make sure there's maintenance on the site and buy a domain and then produce the show and all of these different things. You could, let's say you have the finances and you do that, no one's going to go looking for it because everything they're looking for, if it's streaming, it's going to be on Twitch. Facebook has videos and TV now. All of these things have been aggregated and we've been incentivized to congregate there so that someone who wants to be a creator in that way, the way that you do, is almost destined to failure unless they start out using these platforms.
It's like the difference between going to the world to see a Shakespeare play and standing in the street and watching a traveling troupe.
Exactly. I've thought a lot about social media, especially when we're kind of contrasting these sort of algorithm driven and word of mouth driven different social media methods. I've thought a lot about the idea of social media as a public forum in the classical sense, that it's a
Mm-hmm.
collection of individuals talking. And on sites like MySpace and other sites that don't include that that optimization for attention, it's like everyone's standing on the same level playing field, and you can move between these groups, and nothing's particularly drawing your attention more than anything else. But with the addition of these algorithms, what happens is they've built stages, and
Mm-hmm.
people will naturally want to go see whatever's going to be on that stage. People will stand for an hour. I mean, I think we've all seen people stand for an hour and stare at a microphone waiting for a band to come on.
Yes.
So it makes it much more difficult, to be heard without this free or nearly free stage that everyone else is looking at. And it makes it much more difficult to have things like arts communities or innovation because eyes are already directed at a stage and you have to figure out how to get on it.
With that, I kind of want to draw the conclusion that social media, or at least the interconnection of humanity, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like anything, it's just a tool. The internet is just a tool that we use. But it's one of those things that it's like it's not it's not that because of the nature of the internet that it provides bad. It's the fact that our philosophy regarding the the internet space has yet to catch up with the technology for it. Because we've seen since the 1950s an increase in technological advancement that we've never seen in all of human history. So our own minds, our own collective consciousness is unable to properly cope with how to handle this new tool.
And the unfortunate reality is these algorithms are trying to teach us how we're supposed to cope with them and how we're supposed to perceive them. Um, Before we were, there was some, I'm going to paraphrase something that was said in the film, but before we were able to understand what we were going to use them for, these algorithms conditioned us to accept them as being a certain way and to do
Yes.
them a certain way and to interact with them a certain way. And then it, in a very real sense addicts us to doing it the way that these algorithms want to optimize for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very unfortunate that conversations into doing it a different way are very rare among a general population.
Yeah, but that's because like we're constantly focused on the addictive side of social media. Like because we don't
Mm-hmm.
have the philosophy, like not only do we not know how to handle what it means to be data mined and what it means to have our identities being the product of these social medias, but also the inability to understand how to do anything differently. One of the biggest things that I've kind of noticed when it comes to addiction, and the biggest thing that I like to bring up is AA. When you're an alcoholic, you tend the best way to not relapse into alcoholism is to steer clear of social situations where you are given opportunity to relapse.
And I think the unfortunate part of how these technologies have grown before we were able to have a thought process the way that AA has the thought process is that sort of really well highlighted in the film. Moving away from that addiction isolates you further and makes things more difficult for you because we weren't able to think about, okay, what do we do with the people who don't want to get on Facebook, or what do we want to do with this or that and the other thing? It was just thrust upon us. And like you were saying earlier, I think there's an idea of passive victimization
Mm.
that is very new. Like everyone can comprehend an assault, but how do you even start to grapple with the idea that as you're going about your day, none the wiser for the most part, someone's selling you and making you an addict to something that you don't need to be, and that was intended to be a really great tool, and for a lot of people is a really great tool.
And one of the ways that I've kind of conceptualized a solution to this, and a lot of individuals in anarchist circles kind of conceptualize it in a similar way, is instead of having individual centralization of social media, have a kind of a federation of social media. Um, because that kind of federation would bring us back to more of a MySpace esque ideation of social media, or even further back to a email ideation of social media, where everybody has their own server, they have their own username, but they can interact with each other.
And still in large groups. I mean,
Yes.
my grandparents are still on massive email group chains for politics.
Mm-hmm.
That those things still exist, those older technologies are still there. But the question then now becomes, how do we take stuff like MySpace or like the way that like Telegram now works with their groups and look at what was right with that and what's wrong with these other sites, and how do we optimize them to make them I shouldn't have used the word optimize there, but how do we craft a new space like that can be accepted quickly and converted to quickly the way Facebook was after MySpace, without that addictive incentive.
Mm-hmm.
How do we transition into something better that works for today? And I
And
think
I
that's something
think
that I hope somebody's working on.
and I think that's kind of going back to the differentiation between autopoiesis and addiction. Um, because let's say, for example, let's just say, channeling my inner Shapiro here. Let's take, for example, that if we, as a collective society, force the breakup of a Facebook conglomerate, right? Under things like antitrust laws and things like that. Now, I'm not saying let's go ahead and utilize antitrust laws, but if we had found a way to just end the reign and allow people other options, I think federation would be the best way to fill the void.
I think it would be the best way, and I additional to that, that void is going to be filled by numerous websites very quickly and very frequently. And
Mm-hmm.
I think were that to happen, we have to be very careful in that we don't want to just set up the exact same system that these algorithm-driven sites use, and we should be intentionally looking at how we're spending our time online with any potential new sites, and how we are selecting what to take part in, because there are going to be a lot of sites, probably even very soon, just because of this film, trying to solve this problem.
Because it's a very bad take to say that things like the internet or technology are inherently bad. It's a very small brain take. It's pretty much it's misunderstanding the problem, and it's not that the algorithms or even the optimizations are bad. It's that they're being implemented badly.
What we're trying to optimize isn't working
Correct.
for how we're trying to live our lives. And I think of what these algorithms are optimizing for now as, in a way, authoritarian when we think about
Yes.
attention as economy. These algorithms now are telling you what you must see. They're limiting your choice in the way that I talked about earlier, and they're directing the way you look at the world. And I don't think that was an intended consequence, but it's certainly a very real one, and it's something that can be changed because these companies are individuals.
You bring up this idea of our modern conceptualization of social media as inherently authoritarian, and I keep bringing up this idea of federation, and the thing that we want to optimize for is autonomy. We want to optimize for the democratization of these spaces. Not necessarily the idea of, oh well, I'm deciding what's going on here and you don't, and more of like, oh well, we are coming together to manifest reality together.
Virtually, exactly.
Yes.
We're manifesting. We want to manifest those things that we've kind of lost with the rise of social media. Those small groups of friends that get together for coffee. Especially with COVID and stuff right now. How are you going to find those new people? How are you going to find all those really great things that social media helps us do, is new social connections? And rather than telling people through these authoritarian type algorithms that we have now what they should be doing, we should be finding a way to incentivize people finding those same things with more choice and more conscious knowledge of what they're choosing.
And I want to be clear, we're not arguing for returning to what the internet used to be, because by no means does tradition inherently mean good. What I think, or at least what I'm trying to argue for, is that we need to learn from the lessons of the past and grow upon them.
Exactly.
What is happening now isn't working. Period. I don't care who you are, it's not working.
And it's not only not working, it's actively harming people, not just in a mental health sense, but just in a societal sense. And I absolutely agree. We've touched a lot on MySpace and the virtues of MySpace, but MySpace was not a perfect, or really in a modern context, even great platform.
No.
But there are things that MySpace did, and this is what I think you're getting at, is that we can do again. It's not dead. We can find a way to allow these actions we take on the internet to be more diverse, while still optimizing a service for the needs of right now, and the standards of right now. MySpace is just like a cool example of one thing we did right.
Yeah.
We can look into so much else.
And I think the other thing we need to do is solve the halting problem. I can. We're not going to be able to solve the halting problem, but we do need to take into effect that whenever we are programming things for optimization purposes, we need to understand that these algorithms do not understand when to stop.
You
If
can't
you
expect a machine that only makes paper clips to not see the world as a potential paperclip. I think it's
exactly, exactly. Well, I think that's everything that I had. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Tyler.
I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and this has been a pre-recording, so I'm going to go ahead and send it back to my future self, and we'll go ahead and end off the show.
Have fun, future self, future gecko.